Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this ATM virtual session, the second in our aviation series. And I'm very glad today to say that we've got an extremely experienced airline leader. He's led 3 major airline groups in Europe. He did announce he was going to retire early last year, but the world intervened, so to speak, since then. And he's now Director General of IATA, and his name, of course, is Willie Walsh. So, Willie, welcome to ATM Virtual, I think, for the first time.
Thank you, John. Glad to be with you.
Because it would be nice if we were sitting in the warm sunshine down in Dubai, which is where I normally am doing these kind of interviews rather than in this remote fashion. Well, Willie, as I mentioned, you of course announced, I think at the end of 2019, you were going to hang up your boots, so to speak, and retire. And then the world did intervene and you stayed on a few months longer to head up IAG and guide them through the initial period of this crisis. But I must admit, you can imagine there was a lot of industry conversations going on when you announced the retirement. And a number of people I spoke to we were saying, well, do you think Willie's really going to retire? And I must admit, personally, I didn't really see it. I could imagine you wanted to maybe get out on your boat and sail down the Shannon River, have a bit more time to have a few Guinnesses, but it didn't seem that it was likely you would do that. But equally, I wouldn't have necessarily said that IATA was going to be a position that you would be sitting in today.
No, but quite honestly, John, I can tell you my intention was to retire. I had spent 41 years in the industry, so I thought that was long enough, but I've obviously decided to extend that. And, it shouldn't have come as a surprise to people because I had talked about it for some time. And, internally within IAG, we had been going through the process of ensuring a smooth transition to a new leader. And the board, as you would expect, wanted to be in a position to be able to assess external and internal. I always recommended that Luis should succeed me, and I'm pleased that the board decided on that. So when I announced that I was going to retire in early January of 2020, that was my intention. And as you say, I had plans to get out of my boat and do all the things that I hadn't had time to do. But then with the development of the coronavirus, and as it became very clear to everybody going through February and into March that this was certainly looking a hell of a lot worse than anybody had first expected. I agreed to stay on until September, just to have a bit of continuity through the initial part of the crisis, but also to give Luis a bit more time to understand what he would want to do. I felt bad, and I certainly would have felt terrible leaving in March and handing it over to Luis at that stage, given the state of the industry. And, after I stood down in September, that was it. I was sad to leave, particularly in the circumstances with the way the industry was. But then I was approached about IATA, and I did think about it for a short while, but concluded that actually I could make a contribution in the IATA DG role. So once I sort of embraced the idea, I was 100% behind it, and I'm delighted now. I'm enjoying my time here, still within my first 2 months, but beginning to make some changes and steer IATA in the direction that I think it needs to go at this point in the industry's development, which is clearly still very, very challenging for everybody.
Absolutely, and I guess I think you said when you made your acceptance speech, everybody's leadership style in DG terms has been different. You're not a stranger to challenge. You stepped away from running a specific airline group, but of course the industry is now in its biggest challenge, biggest crisis ever. And maybe you could say that suits your own style to get to grips with that. And I suppose that would have been a key piece of thinking when you took the decision to say yes to the position.
Yeah, I think my role at IAG actually was quite similar to a role at IATA. I think had I been, still the CEO of British Airways, transitioning from that to IATA, would have been much more difficult. But I had sort of stepped back from the day-to-day operational issues at IAG because that's the structure we put in place, which I think was absolutely the right structure. You'd expect me to say that, but it allowed the airlines to focus on the areas that they should be focused on. It allowed us at IAG to think more longer term and spend more time debating strategic issues. I think that certainly helps with what I'm doing here. I firmly believe that IATA has a very important role to play. I've been active in IATA for many years. I spent 13 years on the board of governors. Stood down in 2018, but I know how IATA operates. I know the difference that IATA can make. But I also know the challenges that IATA faces, and particularly in this environment when clearly all of the members of IATA are going through a very, very challenging time, as you quite rightly say, the most challenging period in the history of the industry. So, I feel the industry needs to have a united voice. There are a lot of things that are in common. Clearly there are issues that not all airlines will agree on, and that's fine because, we are a competitive industry. But there are a lot of issues where, the industry does agree. And at a time like this, the focus really has been on getting international aviation moving again. And I'm optimistic. I think we're seeing, evidence of that beginning to happen now. It's not happening at the pace that I think any airline would like to see. We're still seeing quite I describe it as ultra-conservative approach being adopted by many governments. In some cases, I think their approach has been quite repressive. I'm very critical of what the Irish government is doing because I think their approach has been genuinely repressive, not just conservative. We do need to offer help to governments to properly assess the risk that they're facing at this stage, because I think that's something that we as airline executives do very well because we do it every day. Risk is embedded in our business. It's not something that politicians have necessarily managed on a regular basis. And I think the risk appetite that politicians tend to have is very, very low. And that certainly has influenced many of the decisions that we're seeing at the moment.
Definitely, there's a number of things that we can discuss about governments as we go along. Just a quick couple of things on IATA, Willie. You mentioned there about not all airlines may agree. And I was thinking, it's a broad church. The industry is a broad church, both in size of airlines, financial health, ownership, business model, you name it. Do you see that maybe even out with this particular crisis as one of the areas that you're going to have to give a lot of attention to try to get more unity in getting the industry voice across? And just as a supplementary to that, would you look at maybe even trying to widen the coverage of IATA? Because the industry was already in a state of change in terms of business models. So one of the things that I certainly see, and I guess you'd have reflected on here in Europe, is large airline groups like low-cost airlines not in IATA. Do you think there may be a change in the composition as we move ahead?
I'd like to think that when airlines look at IATA, they see value in what it is we do. And that's the point I've been making internally. We can't just expect airlines to join IATA. They will only join if there's something of additional value that we can offer them. And I believe we can do that. In fact, it is interesting that as we go through this, one of the key developments within IATA is the IATA Travel Pass. And as you would expect, that was something that we were designing for our members, but we've had a lot of airlines who are not members of IATA approach us about that, including the major low-cost carriers. So, I think there are aspects of what it is we do does generate value to everybody. If you think back, one of the core activities of IATA was the settlement systems that IATA operated, and they weren't as relevant. In fact, in many cases, weren't at all relevant to low-cost airlines because of their business model. So I could see that if they were looking at IATA, they'd say, well, that's not relevant to me. Therefore, what is it you do that can add value to my business? I take some optimism from what we've managed to achieve in Europe with the creation of Airlines for Europe, because what we saw there was that the 5 major airline groups or airlines in Europe recognized that there was a lot of common ground on issues that we felt needed a united voice. And equally, we recognized there are a lot of issues that just weren't relevant for an association or an organization to focus on because we'd never get agreement. So, if IATA can add value, then I would expect people to want to work with us. If we can't contribute anything, well then, it's natural that they shouldn't want to work with us. But I'm hoping that we will be able to convince more airlines that being a member of IATA is a good thing. And the more people we have involved, the better. The one thing I do always reflect back on, John, you will know this, is the IATA AGM in Singapore, where I think for the first time there was open criticism of how IATA operated. And I can remember, the leaders in that debate, Akbar, Tim Clark, and Tim's words have always resonated with me. In fact, I still have the airline business edition from the way they do it every day at the IATA AGM, where Tim is quoted saying, IATA is an organization run by the few, for the few, and that has to change. And I agree with them. I think that was a valid criticism at the time. And I certainly bear that in mind. So we have to be relevant to every member, not just the big members who've traditionally had representation around the board of governors. We have to make sure we're relevant to every business model and every size of airline. And I can assure you that's something that I'm very focused on.
No, and again, reflecting back to your own experience, I remember one of the chats we had in the past when you talked about your time at the helm of Aer Lingus, and you saw the Ryanair harps kind of going past a window. You recognised this was a fundamental change. If you in Aer Lingus didn't respond, there would be no more Shamrocks, only harps. And now we see the scale of an airline like Ryanair in Europe, or indeed Wizz Air, EasyJet too. These guys have changed the landscape. You've certainly, in airlines you've run, embodied much of that. And I guess to have those voices in the family, so to speak, and all fighting together is going to possibly help in the challenge that you described in getting governments to work with the industry and rather than against it.
Absolutely. And I think we're completely aligned. I listened to what Johan is saying at EasyJet, and I agree completely with his comments. I listened to what Michael is saying. I can't disagree with anything he has said. We're all focused on the same thing here. We want our customers to be able to travel again. We want people, particularly in Europe, where freedom of movement has been a fundamental freedom. We want people to regain that freedom. Globally, we want people to be able to travel internationally. And, we see this as a critical issue, not just for our industry, because it obviously is, you'd expect us to defend our industry, but for global economies. I think we're fortunate that the general economic environment remains reasonably robust. Some of it, I think, is artificial because the amount of support that governments have provided, particularly employee support schemes, to try and keep people in employment, with many sectors adversely affected by this pandemic. But that can't go on forever, so there is a risk that once that government support is withdrawn, we'll see significant increases in unemployment, which will create an economic shock of its own. So, the sooner we can get back to doing business, I think the better for everybody. And we believe it's perfectly safe. Now, everybody understands that governments had to look at taking measures to restrict as much as possible the outbreak of the pandemic. But, given the accelerated rollout of vaccines, which, if you turn the clock back a year ago, I don't think anybody anticipated that we'd have the number of vaccines that have been approved and the rate at which they're being rolled out. The advances in technology with regard to testing, the advances in regard to treating people who contract the virus. So it's a very different environment today than it was 12 months ago. And to argue that all of the restrictions that were put in place 12 months ago are still relevant today, I think is untenable because things have changed. People want to get back to living their lives as normal as possible. And being able to travel is a fundamental part of that.
Well, I mean, bringing that back to what you were saying about governments, I mean, it seems astonishing to me personally that we've had such a disjointed approach by governments, or even within governments, because of regularity and the unpredictability of change, whether it's border closures, quarantines, requirements for testing and so on, and communication messages. But we need these governments on side, and of course, by the very nature, we're in a global industry ourselves with what we do as airlines. How is it that IATA could try to get an in, so to speak, with bodies to try to get these governments around the world, whatever their political complexion may be, to be more aligned. Because we've got the UN, we've got WHO, and we've got the EU, you name it, the different bodies where governments come together, and still there's this incredible, quagmire of dislocation that's having such a big toll as you describe.
Yeah, it's a great point, John, and you're right. If you look at it, like as an Irish person and a European citizen, I'm really disappointed with the way the EU has responded. I would have expected a more coordinated approach within Europe, particularly in a post-Brexit environment. I think it was a perfect opportunity for the EU to demonstrate the importance of the EU and their fundamental, principles. But if you look at it, even when it comes to testing, I was looking at a chart that was sent around yesterday. We've got some governments in Europe, so you expect some alignment here. Some require PCR testing within 24 hours of departure, some 48, some 72. So there isn't even on a simple thing like that. If you require a PCR test, why is it that some governments think it has to be within 24 hours and others think it has to be within 48 hours when there's a wide variety of countries globally who say 72 hours is okay. You then get people or governments who say everybody should be tested, including newborn babies. Others who say no, anybody over the age of 3. Others it's over the age of 6. So on a simple issue like that, that's not rocket science. You would expect governments to be able to align, and it hasn't happened, and that's hugely disappointing. So whatever about trying to get it together globally, getting it together within an entity like the EU has really disappointed me. But that's where we are. So what we've got to do in IATA is start providing evidence and facts to help governments make sensible changes and relax the restrictions that are in place. And I think there's a lot of hard evidence available now, which is great. And I think more and more, some governments are looking at that. I was really pleased to see Germany, for example, look at people who have been vaccinated, no longer a requirement to have testing or to quarantine. People who, can show evidence of a negative test, no need to quarantine. These are steps in the right direction. And I'm now seeing governments that are being influenced by the data rather than the hype or the anecdote. And it's very important. This is too important an issue. Your freedom of movement, a fundamental freedom, too important an issue to be restricted on the basis of political risk rather than genuine health risk. And the health risk has clearly significantly reduced given everything that has happened over the last 12 months.
As you said, I mean, the industry itself has made a lot of steps forward in terms of not least the travel passport, the use of technology. It's an industry also, as you described it, by our very nature, we are safety focused. I mean, it's what the industry has built its reputation on. Every day, every flight that operates. So we perhaps need to see more leadership, as perhaps is happening now in the USA, where, because at least the USA for its own citizens is saying, if you're fully vaccinated, you're pretty well good to go. And travel, we can relax certain aspects of life. That perhaps needs to be pushed forward as a model around the world.
Yeah, well, there's very clear evidence that the vaccination does have a significant impact on reducing transmission, which is a real positive. And also very clear evidence that people who are vaccinated, if they are infected with the virus, the impact of that is significantly less. So, if you go back, what governments were saying early on was, we had to protect the vulnerable in society, and everybody agreed with that. But the vulnerable, in many cases, have been protected now. They've been vaccinated. So I think it's rational and reasonable for people to say, okay, we now want to see evidence of these restrictions being relaxed to enable us to get back and operate the way we have done in the past.
We've talked about the challenge of engagement with governments. As part of this ATM virtual, I was talking with Gaithel Gaith, CEO of Fly Dubai, and he was telling me that the UAE's airlines, obviously Emirates, Fly Dubai, Air Arabia, they have been consulted by the UAE government right from the beginning. He was very clear. He said we haven't always got what we wanted, but they've been at the table. There's been a 3-step process. I think that's also interesting to see that the UAE, which has long been talked about, and you're of course very familiar and very clear in your views about Gulf carriers and Gulf aviation, but to be at the table, I mean, is a start. To be at the table and consulted. I've been surprised in recent months when decisions have been taken by governments, and you think, well, have they spoken to anybody in the industry? Have they even asked for an opinion? Either they ignore it.
Yeah, no, I think it's well, I've talked positively about the attitude of governments in the Middle East, where they see the contribution of aviation as being very significant for their economies. I've always held it up as an example of, where that economic contribution is genuinely valued, cherished, and not taken for granted. And you know what they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's been part of the problem. So I think there are governments around the world who deserve great credit for engaging with airlines to see what is possible. And as I said, airlines are understand that some restrictions had to be introduced. Nobody was arguing for a situation where we just went on and blindly followed what we did before, because to be honest, we wouldn't have done that. Our own risk assessment would have said this doesn't make sense. So there was a natural acceptance of some of these restrictions. But we carry out risk assessments all the time, and we're constantly reviewing the risk, because we would have identified what the risk is, we would have put mitigating actions in place. We're all the time reviewing it. That's how you approach risk. And as you see, the risk reducing or additional measures that can be put in place to further reduce the net risk, that's what we do. We just want the same approach to be adopted by governments, and I think in some cases that there's clear evidence that is the case. In others, not so much. But I think once we get moving, people will move pretty quickly and fall into line, because otherwise they are going to suffer. Tourism is so important for many economies around the world. International trade, so important. But just being able to see your friends and family, to be able to take a well-deserved holiday. And not everybody wants a holiday at home. It's not for everybody to do that, and some countries are better prepared to look after their local tourists than others. But everybody just wants to get back and start, regaining the freedom and the liberty that they've had in the past.
You mentioned about the big progress on vaccinations. Do you have any worry, or do you feel the need to push as IATA about acceptance of different vaccinations? As you said, we wouldn't have imagined a year ago we'd have several that seem to be doing a very good job. But in some areas, it does seem to be maybe a bit of a risk of a kind of a vaccine hierarchy about we'll let you in if you've got this one, we won't let you in if you've got that one. And of course, the other challenge alongside that is new variants. We keep hearing stories about new variants. The UK is concerned currently about what the consequences of the Indian variant may be, for example. What's your sort of reflection on those 2 points?
Well, in the first case, I'm clearly not a scientist, but I think I've been able to read enough about this to know that new variants should not come as a surprise. There's always going to be new variants. They mutate. Viruses mutate all the time. It's how they remain in existence. So that clearly can't be a surprise to the scientists dealing with this. And I think the technology around vaccination has improved significantly through, the development of the vaccines that we've seen for coronavirus. And certainly, everything I've seen gives me confidence that the experts behind this will be able to deal with any change in mutation and variation. I think what is important, though, is that the approval of vaccines that is based on data. That's the way it's done. I think no system will have credibility if they're assessing one vaccine against one set of criteria, but a vaccine that's developed in another country against a completely different set of criteria. That makes no sense whatsoever. And actually, I think this will be done properly, where the data is presented and it's consistent with the way the vaccines have been assessed, well, then I expect vaccines to be approved. And we are seeing evidence of that. This shouldn't be a game of politics. It's too important. Where vaccines are credible and can be shown to be safe based on the data, then they should be accepted and approved.
Now, of course, the industry is facing a heavy toll in financial losses. Traffic, especially international, is still at an emaciated level compared to pre-pandemic. What do you see in terms of the way forward? I mean, one of the things I remember many times talking with you, you're always very focused as an airline leader on keeping costs to a minimum, keeping good cash resources. Indeed, IAG, your former group, is one of those who came into this in a much better state of resilience by having cash. Others like Ryanair or Wizz Air, who talk about having not months, but maybe a year or two's liquidity available. But we are seeing a big variety in terms of airline positions. Many airlines, they didn't have that liquidity. They can't easily get it. Some, of course, have had governments pumping money in, and whichever way we look at it, debt load is going to increase phenomenally for the years ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely right, John. Like we estimate at IATA that the debt burden has increased by $220 billion to date. And I suspect that will increase further because, everybody is focused on liquidity. Cash is absolutely king. That's what keeps you alive. And for some airlines, actually, the cash crunch is ahead of them because, they will face the real cash challenge when they start trying to ramp up their business, because they don't have the traditional cash reserves that you have from sales in advance of carriage, because nobody's selling tickets. So ramping up is going to be a real challenge for people, making sure that they get that right, because a lot of the costs that have been eliminated because people aren't flying. You're not paying for fuel. In a lot of cases, you're not paying your employees because they've either been furloughed or are receiving support from governments. You're not paying airport charges, air traffic control charges. All of these costs will ramp up very, very quickly. And if you get an imbalance between the cost ramp up and the revenue build up, then the cash burn is going to be quite significant. So I think for undercapitalized, cash poor airlines, they're going to have to be really cautious as they see evidence of a recovery in the industry. The good news, though, is it's very clear that there's strong underlying demand. Demand is being suppressed by travel restrictions. Everything shows us that when you remove those restrictions or relax those restrictions, the demand will come back very strongly. We're seeing that in domestic markets that haven't really had any travel restrictions, where domestic markets are pretty much back to where they were. Certainly in the large domestic markets, US domestic leisure is probably above where it was in 2019. Still domestic business impacted, but that will come back as businesses start to move again. So I think we've got good reason to be optimistic that the demand will come back and come back very strongly. I think the challenge for airline CEOs and management teams will be to be very careful around the cash as that ramp up starts again.
It's a real test, isn't it, of airline management skill? I mean, who would want to be an airline CEO or any airline leadership position hands-on right now? Because whichever way you turn, you're facing a phenomenal challenge of one kind or another.
Sorry, John, you're absolutely right. And particularly around cash, because cash often is something that airlines haven't been too bothered, not bothered about. Clearly it's very important. But because of the business model, it has always been the case that airlines can generate cash. I saw it firsthand back in 2001 after the tragic events of 9/11 when I took over at Aer Lingus, because the challenge Aer Lingus faced back then was not debt, because Aer Lingus didn't have any debts. In fact, its balance sheet was almost debt free, but it had no cash. So we had a lot of unencumbered assets, A330 aircraft, brand new, but nobody was prepared to provide you any funds using an A330 as security at a time when transatlantic travel had just fallen through the floor. So cash is critical. Managing cash is really important. I've always had a very clear focus. I think it was one of the positives about IAG, because we had airline CEOs who'd experienced what 9/11 and the post 9/11 environment was like, we've always focused on ensuring that we had adequate liquidity. And to be honest, you can never have too much liquidity. And as we've seen through this, this crisis has extended way beyond what anybody would have expected. And the amount of additional liquidity that airlines have had to raise, be it through debt or equity, has been phenomenal, which clearly will play a significant part on how the industry develops post-crisis.
Absolutely. I spoke to Michael O'Leary a few months ago. And, of course, he to the outside world, people would criticize him for being so seemingly penny pinching and so focused. And yet, as you described, it's absolutely necessary. And I put it to him, where does that mentality come from with you, Michael? Is it because you trained as an accountant? He said, no, because I grew up on a farm. And on a farm, those winter months were tough. You didn't have income coming in. You didn't spend anything you didn't need to spend. You tried to buy when prices were low and sell when prices were high. But I think there is a need to have that ingrained in the mindset. And we're seeing now how it's separating out those airlines that did do it and those that have not done so. The challenge of governments getting involved in airlines, we've seen some strong airline groups, ordinarily strong airline groups and well-managed groups, still having to accept governments to get involved. I mean, Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa in Europe, the Gulf carriers, thinking about the ATM that we're talking at today. Government money has had to come in. Would you be worried that governments will try to go back to, if you like, the bad old days of wanting to have too much political influence in running airlines, or do you think managements can fend that off?
No, I'm not worried, because to be honest with you, I think governments will want the money back. And the only way they're going to get the money back is if they allow the airlines to operate in a commercial, rational way. I think it's been helpful that governments have provided debt, and it has mainly come through the form of debt, which airlines will have to repay. And I fully expect, I like dealing with finance ministers, maybe more than transport ministers, because I think like them, and they're always focused on balancing the books as well. But when I look at finance ministers, I can be absolutely sure that they want to get repaid. They want the money back, and they want it back as quickly as possible, because they're going to need it. So I'm not worried about that. I think airline management teams have a really, really tough job ahead of them, and to do it and do it properly, they're going to have the freedom to operate in an industry that's going to be as brutally competitive as it's ever been. I've no objection to governments being involved. And governments in Europe, I think, have not always made good shareholders, but we've seen governments in other parts of the world where they are excellent shareholders in supporting the ambition and development, the ambition of the airlines and the development of the airlines. And the Middle East is a perfect example of that, where, as I said, they genuinely value the economic contribution that the airlines make. That's why I've always admired what's gone on in the Gulf. I think it's a great example to governments around the world, where you have very efficient, well-run airlines providing great service and operating successfully in a competitive environment.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? You look at the big three hub carriers in the Gulf. Etihad had already taken a decision pre-pandemic to massively reduce its activity and become a medium-sized carrier. They divested of routes and aircraft, a very different structure to what it was only 2 or 3 years ago. Emirates, of course, has had to go out and raise private market funding. It hasn't simply turned to a shareholder, which is not to say that the shareholder has not been involved. And Akbar, your good colleague from IAG days, and indeed very active in IATA, he's always said he's a businessman ahead of anything else. So he's out trying to recover his airline after the sanctions and indeed deal with this crisis. You would think if the critics were to be accepted and listened to, these airlines would just be sitting back and doing nothing, but it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because they're commercial airlines, and they're well run. I think the issue in in the Gulf, and I've said this for many years, I could always see an argument for two significant hub carriers and hubs in the Gulf. I struggle to see how you could operate with three, given the other competition from hub airports around the world. So I think the decision of Etihad to reassess the business model was very, very sensible. But you look at Dubai as a hub and Doha as a hub. They clearly have continuing ambition to play a role as global hubs, and I think they will. But everybody, doesn't matter how well the airline has been run. You talk about Wizz and Ryanair, two exceptionally run airlines in Europe. They've had to access funds and have accessed government funds, both of them in the UK through the CCFF, which is funds made available on a commercial basis, and that have to be refunded, repaid. Same in the US. It's been a combination of grants and debt, and the government there has imposed some restrictions, but actually the restrictions are very sensible because they're designed to incentivize the management team to pay back that debt as quickly as they possibly can. So I'm not worried about government influence. In fact, if anything, I was surprised at how sensible some of it was structured as we went through this crisis. What I am concerned about, though, is the challenge that airlines will continue to face, and particularly the challenge that they face if there's uncertainty in the market around borders being open. That's what will kill demand going forward, because as we've seen, demand is strong, but what's killing it is where you impose these restrictions. And if there's any sense that restriction is removed and then reintroduced at short notice, that certainly will interfere on the recovery in the industry.
Well, as you said earlier, Willie, we've seen strong performance in domestic markets, be it China, be it USA, Russia, for example. We just haven't seen remotely that same traction for long. Or cargo, of course, has been a big saving grace with the belly hold capacity of many wide-bodied aircraft, particularly aircraft like the 777-300. Do you really see any glimmers of light yet? I think Alexander, one of the last things he said, he saw some hope. For example, US, Europe might open up. And I mentioned, of course, the US is talking pretty positively about its citizens being able to travel. Your former groups, IAG, BA, Aer Lingus, all absolutely immersed in the transatlantic market. Do you see those markets like that coming back this year? Because we're into the second summer of not having this major revenue stream and profit stream for a number of airline groups.
Yeah, I see reason to be optimistic, particularly in the second half. Obviously, the recovery is taking longer. Most airline executives probably expected to see a recovery starting in the first quarter, and certainly we're optimistic about a strong second quarter. Clearly that hasn't happened in international markets, but I think there is reason to be optimistic when we look to the second half, because the way the vaccine rollout has accelerated. In a lot of cases, nearly 70-80% of the population will be fully vaccinated as we get into the second half of this year. And that really does provide the opportunity. And I think people will want to see evidence. As citizens, we've been calm, we've tolerated what's gone on because people have told us that there's hope, and that hope is being unlocked by the vaccine. So people expect to see that freedom to travel being returned as the vaccine rollout continues. So I am optimistic that we will see that. And if you look at, again, demand, with very strong evidence, you look at the UK to the UAE, going back to December of last year, because the UAE was on the green list, if you like, for the UK. Huge demand for travel into the UAE, because people want to travel, people wanted to have a break, and it was the place to go. So the amount of capacity that was put into that market at very short notice to fulfill the demand that was in place was great. So we know that when the restriction is removed, people will start traveling again. And I'm optimistic, as I said, that will happen in the second half of this year.
Well, you mentioned the UK green list. Of course, there was much expectation recently of the UK government publishing a green list, and the UK was, perhaps to my mind, surprisingly been trumpeted as a country that was leading the way in the return to travel. Then the green list came out, and there was only really about 2 countries that had meaning for travel on the list. Iceland and Portugal. The UAE is not on that green list. Would you be critical of the UK government there, or do you think they've got justifiable caution? As you said, politicians are not good at taking risks.
No, they shouldn't. To be honest, they shouldn't have bothered. I listened to the press conference from Grant Shapps after, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. I said, why are they bothering to do this? It wasn't just a disappointment, it was a sham. So I think where I do give credit to the UK government is they have provided a roadmap. They've said, we'll do this on this date, provided. We'll do this on this date, provided. And, therefore people can understand and can measure the progress. And they've been, very clear about the ambition to reopen the UK by the, 3rd week in June. But I think the introduction of, the announcement about the green list was a huge anticlimax, and realistically, they should have held off and waited for a few weeks and do it properly rather than waste everybody's time. That's I didn't watch the full hour of the briefing. I think I maybe watched about 40 minutes, but that's 40 minutes I won't get back. I learned nothing from that presentation.
And Willie, when we do start to get through this crisis, it won't be the only pandemic we have. We've learned lessons. We are still learning lessons from this. How do you see the shape of the industry? You were always a man of talking about consolidation, IAG being a consolidating group, and indeed that's what happened with Aer Lingus coming to the group, British Midland, Vueling, the original genesis of IAG between Iberia and BA. How do you see the shape and structure of the industry, and included in that maybe the role of different business models as well, for example, hubs, low-cost carriers and so on?
Well, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is it will be a smaller industry because we're not going to recover all of the capacity. It's just impossible. You look at the number of aircraft that have been retired, and the scale of the layoffs and furloughs that have taken place. Airlines, even if the demand was there tomorrow, they cannot build back up to the scale that they were operating at in 2019. So it'll be a smaller industry. I think it'll be a more cautious industry. I don't expect to see M&A activity, principally because people will be very guarded about the cash that they have, and I can't see many opportunities that airlines CEOs will pursue. It's just too risky, to spend your valuable cash resources trying to acquire something at this stage. I think consolidation will take place through, unfortunately, some airlines will shrink, some will probably disappear. We've seen a few failures, we may see some more, and the gaps that they leave will be filled by, other airlines. But I think it'll be a smaller, more cautious industry, and I think that caution is justified. Because nobody wants to survive this crisis only to fall over, when the recovery starts. And I go back to what I said. I think you're going to have to be very careful about the pace at which you build up your network again. And it, John, better than anybody. When you're operating a network, there are parts of the network that are less profitable, or in some cases unprofitable, because they're at a development stage. Airlines are not going to be able to take the risk of operating unprofitable routes, in the short term. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch how we rebuild. But I would expect to see caution, and I would certainly urge caution. Now there will be some airlines that have continued to strengthen their position. The balance sheets are still strong. All of them, weaker than they were, but some relatively strong, and will see this as an opportunity to gain some market share. So it's not going to be the same answer for everybody, but the shape will will be smaller but competitive, and you'll still see hub carriers, network carriers, regional carriers, low-cost carriers. There's nothing that I've seen fundamentally changes or undermines any business model that existed prior to this. It'll just be airlines that are, were fundamentally sound coming into the crisis, should be fundamentally sound coming out of it.
I guess there's going to be more, even if it's hard to define in business model terms, more fusing of ideas. I mean, just as you, described how you assimilated what you saw Ryanair was doing to strengthen Aer Lingus, and then actually take lessons from low-cost carriers in terms of disciplines into a network airline group like BA and IAG. And I guess we're going to see more of that, because, as you said, if the industry is smaller, which I would also agree is inevitably likely, gaps are going to appear at some airports, the Heathrows, maybe even the Dubais, the Frankfurts, and so on. And other airlines are going to move in, maybe of a different type. So it is going to be an amazing melting pot, I guess, in the years ahead.
Absolutely, and that's why I say it'll continue to be extremely competitive. Nothing has changed the competitive nature of this industry, and everything points to it continuing to be very competitive. I think the one issue that we do have to recognize is that in the short term, I'd like to think that demand will outstrip the supply, which will be a positive for airlines. But I think we need some positives. But it's going to take time for airlines to repair their balance sheets. As I said, they're naturally going to be not going to have the same appetite to expand as maybe they had. And I suppose in the back of everybody's mind, having gone through this, you always learn from having gone through a crisis. It's the great thing about our industry. We do learn and we adapt. I think people will sort of in the back of their mind saying, is there going to be another crisis like this? So that's why I think the effort initially will be repair the balance sheet, strengthen the cash position, do everything you can to ensure good liquidity, and be in a place to survive what may be a couple of cold winter months ahead. But as I said, I think we've got reason to be optimistic that there will be a strong recovery in demand.
As you said, a lot of learnings. I know a number of airlines said they did their worst crisis scenario planning based on what happened after 9/11 that you described. Yeah. But of course, much worse came along. Some airlines did their pandemic planning on the basis of maybe a geographically limited impact. Nobody could foresee this humanity industry embracing crisis that we face now. So there has to be learnings from it. I mean, personally, I get a lot of young people, I'm sure you do, approaching you about, is it wise to have a career in this industry? And I say, well, if you can look at this now as a big case study, sadly it's not a case study, it's real, but if you can learn from that and survive, it's really going to stand you in good stead for the future, because we're going to need bright, new, young brains to take the industry forward.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's actually going to be one of the most exciting times for the industry. I am naturally optimistic about the industry. And the reason I'm optimistic is I believe airline leaders today are much more realistic about the job that they face, and have thrown away the acceptance of boom and bust. People want to be consistently profitable through the cycle, and more airlines, have embraced the need to do that. And I think the airlines that have gone through restructuring will have a better cost base coming out of this. But I think, as I said, a lot of that benefit will go to repairing balance sheets in the short term, because when you look at, I think we estimate total debt in the industry now at $650+ billion US. That's not a nice position for any industry to be in. And then you've got to be cautious about whether liquidity will be available, going forward. So, I think it's going to be a fascinating time. It's a great industry still. It's an industry that has always had challenges, but if you like a challenge and you enjoy working in a dynamic industry, you're never going to get a better one than the other.
Absolutely. And Willie, how does this all tie in with the environmental agenda? Something I saw, I think even before you left IAG, was I could see you were taking this very strongly by the horns yourself. You'd been even critical the industry had not got itself further ahead. Right now, of course, I was just reading yesterday, the industry produced not even half its previous levels of emissions last year, of course, because of the suspension of activity. But we've talked about improvements to kind of net zero carbon and so on by 2050. You and I are not likely to be on this planet by that point in time, but how are you going to drive this from IATA's point of view? Because the industry so often seems to have a back foot. It's on the receiving end of taxes from governments, criticism, public agendas. Can the industry get back to the point of leadership and manage its own destiny on this very serious topic?
I think we can, John, and I've always been passionate about this, and I think we do have to get on the front foot. I think we've got a great story to tell. I think we've done a lot of very good things. We've done some bad things as well, and that's where we need to be honest. I think that's part of the challenge we face. We've probably been overly defensive, and have sometimes tried to defend the indefensible. But I think we do have a good story to tell. I think there is genuine commitment. More than ever, I see airline leaders wanting to address this, embracing the need to address it. And to be honest, we have to, because the external pressure is not going away. We've not seen focus on the environment in any way wane through this period. If you go back to what we witnessed in 2008, in the lead into the collapse of Lehman's September 2008 and the global financial crisis, we could see environment was probably number one and number two on everybody's agenda. Post during the global financial crisis, it certainly slipped down the agenda. It hasn't budged this time around. It's still up there. And, you look at the change in attitude in the United States and the pace at which the industry in the United States responded. So in other words, it wasn't that they were lagging the change in administration. They were already thinking that way. So it wasn't so much that the politics had changed. Airline CEOs in the US, I think, had acknowledged this. So I think there's definitely reason to stand up and talk positively about what it is we've done. We've got a big challenge, but I think it's a challenge that we will overcome. The one thing I can say is that my role in IATA is to defend airlines, and that means defending them against others in the, what I call it, the value chain, like air traffic control, ANSPs. They've got to up their game. It's unacceptable that airlines are forced to operate in an inefficient manner. The environmental damage that's being done as a result of inefficient air traffic control is unacceptable. And politicians have to hear that. We've invested billions in technology to enable us to fly in a more efficient manner. It's absolutely scandalous that we're inhibited because of inefficiency on the ANSP side. So, I won't tolerate listening to ANSPs talking about their commitment to net zero in 2050, because, they are part of the problem and they need to, become part of the solution.
Well, some of this has been going on for decades, hasn't it, Willie? I mean, we've got in Europe, we've had the CESAR, Single European Sky, We've got new skies, and in the Gulf, again, the region we're looking at, the Gulf has enormous issues with air traffic capacity off limits for military reasons. And at the stroke of a pen, if we could just break that logjam, there'd be substantial improvements in performance.
We have to, John. And this is where, I'm pleased to see the political push to address the environment. This is within their grasp, and it's significant. The change in Europe, we've identified it. It's between 10 and 12%. It's massive. To get a 10% reduction in CO2, and it's there. It doesn't require investment. The money has been spent. That's the thing that I think really frustrates us as airline CEOs. We've spent the money already. The ANSPs have spent the money in the technology. What's holding it up is, political will and, a refusal to address some, what I think are basic issues. So, we will be calling these people out. We will expect the OEMs to step up and raise their game. So we don't want small changes in the performance. We want to see step change in technology, because it's unacceptable for others to think that at the end of the day, this issue is going to be resolved by airlines writing a big check, bridging the gap between what we can achieve through operations, technology, investment, performance, bridging the gap with paying for either some form of offsetting or emissions trading. That's not going to happen. We expect everybody to play their part, and where we see gross inefficiency evident, we're going to call it out and we're going to demand that they address it, because we're not paying the bill for that inefficiency. We've already paid to get an efficient system. We need to see that being delivered.
Well, as you said, I mean, aircraft themselves, the new technology aircraft are more than capable of flying safely, far more close together, for example. We've seen things that probably you and I never would have imagined to happen, even if this last year of crisis, like North Atlantic tracks have been cancelled because there's so little traffic. Airlines can fly the most optimal routing and not the one that is to deal with the congestion of flow. We've had no holding at airports like Heathrow, unbelievably, even the airport able to operate on 1, not 2 runways. So the aircraft side is there. As you said, it's the infrastructure around it to allow that to be exploited on a regular daily basis.
No, absolutely. It's ridiculous to think that we're still following airways that were designed when aircraft were navigating using NDBs and VORs, but that's the reality of it. These are tracks that were established in the 40s, 50s. We don't need them today. The technology is so far advanced. And even, I can remember flying 737-200s back in the 80s. We would ask for direct routing based on, dead reckoning, because, we didn't have INS or ONS or, the equipment that we have available today. But we were able to work out where we were, and we were able to figure out, a rough track to where it is we needed to get to. So we were always trying to fly from A to B without going through, all the other letters in the alphabet. So, we've got to address this issue. The environment is too important. And it's, it will be the number one issue for the industry once we get through this crisis. It's natural that airlines are focused on survival. But once we're confident about that, we will be turning all of our attention to addressing this issue, and we will expect everybody to play their part.
I think it's going to be fundamental, isn't it, Willie? I mean, the industry can't make excuses. It can, as you say, call out where partners, governments are not playing their part. And not least, again, we've talked probably enough already about governments today, but, the tax take from the industry, think about the UK alone, several £1 billion taken from industry and air passenger duty. We don't see investment back, whether it is in the infrastructure, whether it is in substantial amounts of research in alternative fuels, pushing forward engine technology and so on.
Yeah, it's I think it's bizarre when you see that a government can cause an airline to operate inefficiently and then tax the airline for operating inefficiently. Which is some of what we're saying. It's like the criticism I have of governments who are mandating PCR testing and then charging VAT on the PCR test. That to me is just unacceptable. They're mandating it on the basis of a health crisis. They shouldn't be looking to make money off the back of that. In the same way as the environmental challenge and crisis that we will face, they shouldn't be looking to make money off that. They should be using money to ensure that we can achieve the goals that we have.
Absolutely. And Willie, just a brief point on safety. I think IATA commented last year, as we got into this crisis, and of course flying stopped, and you know better than anybody as a former pilot, as you said, you're a 737 captain yourself. Many pilots, maybe around about half, I think, at least, of the world's pilot force has not been able to fly. There's been minimal flying for those that have done so, and of course simulated time's been used. But I think it was last year IATA raised a question about unstabilized approaches, and they were trying to establish if that was a trend or not. What's your perspective on safety management? As we said, it underpins this industry's reputation.
It goes back to my point about cautious in the build-up. Because it's not just caution that will be necessary from a financial point of view, but I think we've got to acknowledge that it will take time for proficiency to, get back up to where it was. The good thing about it is, again, going back to what I said, we use data all the time to analyze the risk. And one of the sources of data we have is when we look at unstabilized approach. It's normally a precursor. It tells you, it sends a warning signal. So when we saw evidence of that, we flagged that, and actually then you see a response. So, this is all about doing what airlines do every day, managing risk, assessing the risk, understanding it, and making sure that, where there is any additional risk that's been introduced, we put mitigating actions in place to ensure that we get back to where we were and continue to improve. So, there will be a bit of a challenge. It's not going to take long, though, to get back to where we need to get back to. Simulators today are so far advanced from where they were. It is like the real thing. So, yeah. So getting pilots back up to speed and other critical employees around the airport back up to speed will take a little bit of time, but not too long. And I'm very, very confident that we will have a safe and secure operation. But it will be one of the things that I know all CEOs will focus on as they start to rebuild their network.
Just one last point on the safety aspect. I mean, you mentioned the OEMs. Boeing in particular has been through a torrid time with the 737 MAX, which is now getting back into service. I asked Tim Clark, and he was pretty critical of Boeing, to be honest, and talked about needing a complete cultural change and focus on the culture of running the business ahead of what they might do for shareholders and profitability and so on. Do you think we can see Boeing make that recovery to this dependable provider of aircraft equipment that they've had for the last century, along with Airbus?
Yeah, without question. I don't hesitate to say that they will get there, and it's too important for the industry. We need effective competition between Boeing and Airbus. There is an effective duopoly for the moment. I think there will be some challengers along the way, but I have confidence in Boeing. I think they're aware of the challenges they face. They've gone through a very difficult time, and I don't think anybody would, want to go through a period like that. But I think many dedicated, professional, focused people at Boeing, and culture change does take a bit of time. And I think Tim is right. Culture is always very important. It's why our industry is so safe, because there's always been a focus on safety culture. I've never met an airline CEO who doesn't understand how important that is. So ensuring that nobody becomes complacent is very important. But I've no doubt that Boeing will get back to where they need to be and where they want to be, and I've full confidence in them being able to do that.
Well, Willie, the clock has almost beaten us. Just if I could ask you one final question. You touched on it already. I mean, you have an optimistic outlook for this industry. You're still passionate about this industry. Obviously, you wouldn't have taken a position if you were not. You would encourage somebody who was starting now to really consider a career in aviation.
Yeah, without hesitation. It's a great industry. I've loved every minute of it. And I've gone through some torrid times. Like 41, 42 years, whatever it is now. I've seen some real lows. But the thing I love about this industry is the way we learn and the way we adapt and the resilience and the, just the spirit that exists. I think there's so many other industries can learn from what it is we do, and I think we do it extremely well. So I'm proud to be part of the industry. I think anybody who's looking, as I said, if you want a challenge in life, if you're interested in something that will really stretch you, you're not going to get anything as good as this. And the opportunities are great. You can experience everything in an airline. We touch just about every aspect of any business. You'll see it in the airline industry. So yeah, I would encourage anyone and everybody. If you're up for a challenge, join an airline.
Absolutely. Well, Willie, it's always a great pleasure to talk with you. We are out of time for this session today for ATM Virtual. I hope next time around I can invite you to actually do it face-to-face down in Dubai. Hopefully I can catch up with you for a Guinness somewhere in the next few months when we're allowed to do so. So Willie Walsh, Director General of IATA, thanks very much indeed for your time today, and good luck in the coming months in getting the industry back on an even keel.
Thanks very much, John. Look forward to seeing you in person.
Thanks a lot, Willie. And that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of the sessions, and you'll be able to watch them again on demand. So for me, John Strickland, it's over now. Goodbye for now.